I'm your host, Maureen Metcalf. I'm the founder and CEO of the Innovative Leadership Institute. We are broadcasting live from West Palm Beach at the International Leadership Association Conference. Today, our guests are Rian Satterwhite and Kathy Allen. Both of our guests co-chair the International Leadership Association Sustainability Leadership Group. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
So each of you have published books this year involving the theme of environmental leadership. Tell me more about each of these books and the need that each is attempting to address. So do you want to start, Rian?
Sure. So the book, Innovation in Environmental Leadership, Critical Perspectives, I want to first start off by acknowledging the other two editors who aren't able to join us, Ben Redekop and Deb Gallagher, who really carried a tremendous amount of the weight of this process. So I wish that they could be here to speak to it. But as an edited book, I think our goal was to really make a strong case that the biosphere, that the natural world is and should be considered the fundamental frame for leadership. We are biological beings. We are intimately and intricately connected to the natural world around us. And yet that's a reality that we often don't take into account in our leadership theory and practice. And so this book represents a wide range of perspectives from people all over the world who are really active in environmental leadership, but are coming together around the idea of the biosphere as the maybe most critical and most fundamental frame for leadership and exploring what that means.
Great, thank you. I actually ran a nature preserve for a while, so this is, and I did not have the skill that you do to bring what I was passionate about into the work I did in the way that you have. So I'm really delighted that both of you are here and representing a perspective that just sounds so foundational to the world we give to our children and grandchildren is at least in as good of shape as the one we inherited, and we're not on that path.
No, we're not. Not right now.
So Dr. Allen, tell us about your book.
It starts actually with a story of responding to my clients' needs. I do a lot of work in leadership and organizational change. And about 12, 15 years ago, a lot of my clients were trying to eliminate silos in their organization. And I looked to the leadership literature, but I didn't really find management and leadership talking in the language of interdependence and connection and integration. And so I started searching other fields and went to the sustainability field first because I thought, okay, this might be a place where this kind of integrative language and ideas might be found. And from there, I found a small little subset of that called biomimicry.
Ah, yes. Okay.
Which is the looking to nature as a model, mentor, and measure. But biomimicry had been doing a lot in design of houses, the design of windmills, a lot of engineering, biological intersection. But they really hadn't done much with bringing those ideas into human organizations. And my work is primarily organizational leadership. So what I started doing was experimenting with how the way nature is designed could be applied to human organizations and human systems. And so my book is really kind of cultivating the lessons of design principles found in nature, like waste is never wasted. It rewards cooperation. It banks on diversity. It depends on self-organization. It runs on sunlight. Some of those frames. And talk about how we could apply that and how it would change the way we approach leadership. And eventually, what happens in nature as their ecological systems evolve into mature forests or prairies or coral reefs is that these systems become more diverse, more interdependent. They maintain the dynamicness and innovation, and they become more generous because they start exchanging nutrients across the system. And so if you're looking for resilience, you also want to look for diversity, which Of course, we know in our financial systems that that's true, but we don't often apply it to our human organizations. And my thought is that if people could live and experience a living system and being led in a living system kind of way, that it would maybe make the relationship to the earth less scary and more inviting, and that it would fundamentally change our worldview and the way we connect with the earth.
Wow, that's a big goal.
Yes. Yes. We're looking for company out there. Anybody who's listening to this would like to join this idea.
You haven't tackled the world's smallest problems. So what can and I think you touched on this, what can environmental leadership perspective add to the broader leadership dialogue?
Well, I think I'll start here. The reason why we titled the subtitle for Innovation in Environmental Leadership Critical Perspectives was we really wanted to strongly bring out that critical dialogue from critical theory explicitly, which is an effort to seek emancipatory practices. And so how do we recognize the limitations of the narratives that we all are drawing from, or the frames of reference, the mental models that we're using, and how do we see those as limiting as well as helpful?
So can you give an example? Because I don't know that some of our listeners will know exactly what you're pointing to.
Sure. So, I think it's fair to probably say that still to this day, the most common, let's say, understanding of effective leadership might be kind of a traditional, charismatic, heroic model. It's what we're used to seeing in the media. It's what we're used to even looking for actively ourselves in different spheres of life. And so a critical perspective would be one that asks, it's not starting from assumption that that's wrong, but it's just asking questions about how does that limit what we pay attention to? How does that limit our behavior in organizations? How does that limit the way we learn about leadership and teach about leadership? And so I think that as Kathy alluded to earlier, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to learn from lessons in nature. And that can easily, or sometimes not so easily, but still usefully be translated into kind of a leadership practice context.
Perfect. At least my whole body of work and what this show is focused on is helping leaders update how they think and behave. So part of it, if I look at a very traditional leader as what I think leadership of the future looks like, so the contrary to our Leadership 2050 book, if I'm looking at traditional, so NCIS and Gibbs, if that's what good looks like, then how do we help people shift to something that looks somewhat different than that? And how does that somewhat different leader consider lessons from the environment and the environment as one of the stakeholders?
Yes. Yeah. And I think just as importantly, and several of our chapter authors make this case, that leadership education and development should be as much about, and I think Kathy actually talks about this in her book as well, that it should be just as much about what we need to unlearn as what we're learning in the process.
Brilliant point. So what's an example of something you wish people would unlearn?
Well, I think that there's right now a vast gulf between the way that leadership is portrayed in popular culture, the way that most of us encounter it in day-to-day life, and the way that some leadership scholars and practitioners and theorists are trying to envision it. And so I think that comes back to this need to unlearn some things, because by the time we actually start studying leadership, that's typically not, in elementary school for the most part. And so by the time you actually encounter it as a subject matter, you have all of this accumulated messaging around what leadership is in our culture and what it's not.
And for those who haven't studied it in university, I think the average age people get their first leadership class is 40.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. So how much life experience, how much messaging have you received?
Have they done before? I mean, seriously, think about the early stuff. I'll say me, you may not have done any stupid stuff. I did a vast amount of things I wish I could undo.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So anything to add to that, and then we're going to go to break.
I think that one of the beautiful things that nature and environmental frameworks can do for us as leaders and organizations is that nature has 3.8 billion years of creating conditions conducive to the life of future generations.
Okay.
And if that's nature's purpose, then what would that look like if we applied that organizationally to our leadership? What would it look like for us to see the soul of leadership not in the level of profit that your organization earns, but actually in the legacy we leave to our communities, our business, the earth? So we kind of begin to build a more expanded time horizon to measure the way we do our work. But we're living in a dynamic, interdependent, complex series of problems right now, challenges, you could say. And most of our frameworks are much more bounded, objective kind of views of our organization. And when we have an object or an objectification to our organization and our leadership frame, what we do is we assume control is possible. We assume that we don't need to build relationships between our organization and the environment and other stakeholders. We assume that we don't need to create conditions conducive to the life of our employees and our supply line and our customers and the earth and our communities and other stakeholders in our world. So there's lots of lessons of what it would look like to lead a living system instead of a system that we've objectified, where we unleash talent instead of control it, where we assume change is already happening and all we have to do is transform the energy that's already there.
Aligned with the bigger system, not
Aligned with the bigger
my
system.
company alone.
Yes. So I think there's a lot to unlearn, and one of them is this kind of objectification of people. Because as soon as you objectify your organization, the employees in it believe that somebody else owns the organization and it's not them, so they don't have to show up to solve the problem. Or if it's objectified from the top down, then they think they own the organization and they can tell the organization what to do because they've got all the control. It's not very helpful when you need a lot of talent and a lot of knowledge and experience and insight at the table to make your decisions.
And that goes beyond environmental. That's a statement about our
innovation
culture
and resilience as an organization, your adaptive capacity.
So how do we change our mindset about leadership?
So I think as Rian was saying earlier, so much of how we think about leadership is kind of part of a larger overculture that we've had that's anchored in seeing organizations as some kind of machine or object.
Yeah.
And
Newtonian physics kind
Newtonian
of stuff.
physics, when in fact our lived reality is that we've always had life in organizations. We've just ignored that it's there. And so, for example, if we were borrowing and learning from the larger environment as a framework, a biosphere, so to speak, or nature as a framework, then we would ask questions like, how do we create stronger connections and help people recognize that they're not separate, siloed individuals, but are actually connected and are in an interdependent system? And that would require us to focus on relationships, focus on connection of ideas, of time, of space between our organizations and our communities, how decisions impact over time the earth and vice versa. And we would have to let go of this, illusion that we can control our world and that we have dominance over it as a point of privilege of being human, and that we would also need to probably let go of our sense of separation.
Those are easy words to say, but as someone who does executive coaching, if my entire way of making sense of my contribution as a leader is that I'm in charge, that I know what I'm doing, that's what people pay me for, to say how I conceived this is completely wrong, then who am I? really becomes the fundamental question. And what value do I bring? Because I don't do that new stuff. I do that old stuff really well. I have the illusion of separate and I'm in control of you and I'm good at telling you what to do and measuring it and creating accountabilities and structured processes. This seems like it would terrify people who are really good at functioning in the existing system.
It could. And I think that a lot of the people I do executive coaching with are people who are trying to push the envelope.
Okay.
Because they tend to be highly effective managers and leaders in traditional senses. And at some point in their journey, they've realized that they can't do it by themselves anymore.
Okay.
So they are figuring out how can they get more company at the organizational leadership table to help move the interests of the whole organization instead of just part of the organization forward. And so it's really out of that need that they start searching. And so maybe my question to your listeners would be, where are you in that journey? Are you still learning how to be a really great traditional leader? Or are you beginning to realize and get frustrated with the limits of that frame? And if you're starting to get frustrated because no matter how good you are, you still can't do it as well as you want it to be, then you're probably getting ready to have these kinds of deeper questions show up in your leadership practice.
And this maps to developmental psychology as well.
Yes.
That there's a jump to post-conventional, and there's a lot of research on that we won't talk about now. But it does seem that there's a very clear delineation where this comes online. And it's a felt sense.
Yeah, and I think that in that certain sectors of our economy are more prone. So if you're in a sector that has a lot of external disruptions happening in your business, then you're going to be more likely to start trying to figure out how to respond to these more complex issues.
Okay.
So that, and then once you start entering into the world of complex problems, not complicated problems, but complex problems.
And adaptive.
Then you need high levels of adaptive innovation to respond quickly to the major disruptions in your sector. So what I find in my leadership practice, my coaching practice, is that those people also are the ones that find me to start exploring these ideas.
So let's define adaptive, because again, our listeners may not know that term exactly as you're using it. So to you, what is an adaptive problem?
Well, it's coming from nature. Nature has kind of what they would call an adaptive cycle that it's been using for billions of years. And the adaptive cycle looks a little bit like an infinity loop on its side. And so the upper left-hand quadrant is explore. The lower left-hand is of the circle is launch. Then you go up to the upper right, that's sustain, and then there's a release, which is the lower right. So the front loop, which is launch and sustain, doesn't stop there. There, at some point, you become too rigid, or your forms no longer fit the purpose that you're trying to do, so you have to adapt. And that means you're releasing a background assumption, a business model, a way of doing something, a program that you've invested time and effort in, and that release allows you to reclaim the energy and resources that have been holding the program in place or the form in place, and then explore to the next round. So this simple explore, launch, sustain, release, and this is a constant loop that you find in nature. And that's one of the reasons why life still exists on this planet 3.8 billion years later, is because this is natural. But it's not natural in human organizations. We really have to work hard to do this because we fall in love with our forms. And we don't know
linear structure. And
this is all of the Rian stuff that he was talking about earlier. It's about how our mental models and other things hold us in this sustaining place that no longer always is functional.
So one thing I want to point out, and then we'll shift to what Ryan's doing, is that not only does the system need to change, I as the leader need to change.
Absolutely.
And often I think leaders are under the belief that it's my job to control that or them, not also change me, them, and that. And when I add me into the equation, it's a very different equation.
And the thing is that when our world was more stable, our external environment was more stable, the idea that a leader knew everything and could control and direct everything was effective. It worked.
At least it wasn't delusional.
But it doesn't work in the world that we're currently living in. We're creating new challenges and problems every single day, and we're trying to solve it with old mindsets. Not very helpful. Nature can teach us a whole lot about more effective mindsets.
Brilliant. Thank you. And so, Rian, how does your work relate and is also different than Kathy?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I enjoy connecting with Kathy so much, is because we, I think, approach our respective work from a very similar place, but the work we do is different. And so while Kathy's working with, high achieving executives who have kind of reached this stopping point and are actively seeking for what helped me through this difficult period, my work with college students is quite different. And I think your observation around this being connected to developmental psychology is really important, because, Kathy's clients may or may not, but may have had that life experience of being able to kind of come to some of those transition points developmentally. Many of my students haven't, and so it's been a constant evolution of innovation, trial and error to figure out what's going to connect for them. On the one hand, I think that I have some advantage in the population that I work with because they haven't had decades and decades of messaging and practice built up, right? And so they're a little less maybe calcified. And on the other hand, they just don't have the life experience to draw upon yet to do some of the critical reflection that's needed through the process. And so in our work with students, both inside and outside of the classroom, we've really had to experiment actively in terms of what are the experiences, what are the settings, what are the conversations that are going to really connect with this population as we talk about sustainability and leadership. I think that the younger generations in particular, this is a more natural way of seeing the world and interacting with the world. I think social media and the idea of networks and systems have really kind of primed some for thinking in this way, but but they still don't have it all figured out. I mean, none of us do, right? So I think there's a natural tendency there that we can build upon. But the hurdle that I face, I guess, the privilege that I have is helping them to make some of the kind of contextual and connections between different concepts that they may not have been exposed to yet.
It seems like it would be really fun to just explore the continuum, which is what you guys get to do.
Absolutely. I think there's more work out there if someone's looking for a dissertation topic.
Well, and if you do your job brilliantly, your job, or Rian, Kathy's job changes.
Yeah, in a wonderful way.
So why do you think that leadership literature has been slow to take up the ecological perspective? And I'm thinking when I first started doing the work in sustainability decades ago, there was a little bit out there, but not much.
I think that's the important starting place, is that it's not that it hasn't been present, but it has been slow to be engaged with and adopted in a big way. So Kathy herself has been kind of writing and thinking about this for a while now. Folks like Meg Wheatley,
my favorite author.
Peter Senge, like there have been a number of people calling attention to this for some time. I think that we're just now beginning to approach a bit of a critical mass in the literature and in the number of sources that people can be exposed to that introduces this concept.
I think also that we have framed the assumption in an odd way. So when I first got into the field, I used to think, how can I keep up with the literature? But the more experience I had, I realized the literature wasn't keeping up with me.
Interesting.
So what happens when you are actively applying is that that's really where the innovation is going. And the time frame to get an idea researched, written, and published is at least, if you're lucky, a 3-year time lag.
If you're lucky.
And usually more like 5 to 10 years. So the literature actually is behind the practice. But the practitioners don't have time to write. So they're inventing, adapting, changing the whole field of leadership and its connection to sustainability in a way that the literature is not able to keep up with because of the nature of publication. So we only get to see it when with that 3 to 5 year time delay.
You know, I'm delighted that you're doing the interviews because we can do these more frequently. And especially because your work is so research focused, we can talk about it before the publication cycle is complete. At least next time. I realize you both have new books sitting here.
But I think that's critical because it's these vehicles that actually help people name and understand what their life is about. They're practicing, they're innovating, they're accelerating their innovation, but they often don't have words or concepts to attach to them. That's really what writing does for people. It gives them meaning and frameworks. And so these vehicles, like with podcasts, can be an extraordinary service to the field because it gives this much more immediate framing and meaning making in terms of the people's leadership.
So let's talk now about why you're so passionate about sustainability and how you connect with nature.
Well, for me, sustainability was the first love. Leadership came second. I was exposed to it second.
But what's your dissertation in?
Well, you know, it really starts much earlier than that for me. And I credit a tremendous amount to my environment and my family, my parents, to really exposing me to this. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon, which in general within the U.S. is kind of, I think, seen as a fairly environmentally conscious city. And so everything from reduce, reuse, recycle, you know, family kind of waste practices, but more significantly than that was just exposure to nature. So even though I grew up in kind of suburban environment, we were constantly taking camping trips and hiking trips and all of that kind of thing that just was absolutely foundational for how I connected to nature and saw myself as a contributing member of this larger system. And so for me, that really came first. I wasn't kind of exposed to leadership development or research or theory until college, my undergraduate degree. And it's been a natural fit for me ever since, because I don't know that I could talk about leadership without this sustainability lens.
Interesting. So you've talked about what exposed you to it. How did you get passionate about it? Because you invest a great deal of your waking hours focusing on this.
Well, I think that once I saw the gap that I perceived to exist in leadership theory and practice and literature, it became something I had to be doing. It became more of a calling. And so while I certainly don't pretend that I'm the only one that sees this, I think that I have a voice that can help bring greater attention and greater effort and energy around leadership for sustainability. And so I see that as a responsibility. I am a parent of 2 young kids. That certainly shapes my experience and my goals and motivations as well. I am concerned deeply about what we are collectively doing, including the decisions that I make to our planet and to the life that we share it with. And I recognize that I'm only here for so long. And this is I can't think of a better purpose than to spend my time helping to hopefully reshape our relationship with nature. And for me, that comes through leadership for sustainability.
Beautiful. To reshape our relationship with nature. Thank you. Kathy.
Like Ryan, I have wonderful memories and experiences in nature as a kid. I don't think that's the only way people get into this passion, but for me, it was a sense of feeling the energy and the beauty around me and how powerful that is as a, a context that you can anchor yourself in. But then I think the sustainability and leadership connection actually started with my belief that if you want to change or transform our systems and our organizations or ourselves, that we wanted to do it in a way that held, as opposed to an experiment that just doesn't hold. Mm-hmm. And so much of my work in change and leadership is really about making sure people's fingerprints are all over it and that they own the solution to it. And if you then add sustainability into it, you can have a sustainable program organizationally, but if people don't have their fingerprints all over it, it doesn't hold. Mm-hmm. And so the sustainability had kind of a double meaning for me. One is sustainability in relationship to your impact in the world around you, and sustainability in the sense of how do you lead and create change in your organization in a way that holds without additional energy attached to it. Mm-hmm. So you're not wasting resources holding change in place that as soon as those resources are redirected will disappear.
It's an interesting question. One of my colleagues talks about having transformed several organizations, and when he leaves, his question is, do they sustain? Mm-hmm. Right. The organization may sustain, but then they're acquired by someone else, or they're run by someone else who wants to put their fingerprint on it. And is the gain that was made wiped out?
Right. So I think, for me, I measure my value and my worth as a consultant and an OD practitioner based on whether things hold. Mm-hmm. And you can't hold that by one person.
Yeah.
The other framework that I've been using, I'm involved with this building resilient community kind of think tank in the Twin Cities. And, we're moving, we think sustainability actually is the middle bar. It's like a zero bar.
Okay.
As opposed to, extraction, minus 50, minus 75. Mm-hmm. So what's the restorative and regenerative capacity of a system? And I think that's where, your title of your podcast series about resilience and thriving organizations, they have this capacity for regeneration and restoration that goes beyond sustainability as the bar. So I think at some point we have to start shifting our expectations and our language. Just like in old, immature forest ecologies, they start contributing back to the commons, the soil. Mm-hmm. If the soil is the metaphor for the commons, instead of extracting from the soil.
Yeah. So young, you extract.
Right.
Middle,
you still extract more than, but you store more things in the root structure. But then as you evolve, become more diverse, you become more resilient, just like our financial portfolios. But you also have a higher capacity to regenerate after disaster. And we have a lot of that going around. So, so how do you build your organizations and lead your organizations so you're truly regenerative and restorative to the balance between nature and organization and leadership? Those, I think, become the more interesting questions going forward.
And to jump on that a little bit, I think one of the challenges that I have wrestled with continuously is how do I prepare students, whom not all are early career, but most are, to go into an organization at an entry-level position and help develop that capacity and deliver that message if it's not an already dominant part of the culture there. And that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to ask anyone to do. I don't know the success rate of that, but that's the conversations we try and have.
Well, you interact with lots of students. Mm-hmm. So while Kathy's leverage is fewer people, more power, your leverage is more people, but less power. Mm-hmm. And if those come together, we'll see quicker change than either one or the other one.
Yeah.
But nature would have an interesting lesson to what Rian just shared. So nature depends on self-organization, and it self-assembles from the molecular level up. And as a result, it means what would happen to our leadership frame if we began to see leadership coming from the bottom versus only from the top or coming from anywhere. And if we are framing things from a nature's lesson, this bubbling up tends to be really where the innovative processes happen. Is where the system is most adaptive.
Okay.
And so we could say, given that as a framework, that what the work that Rian is doing with college-age students will have an impact on the world in a much larger proportion than the numbers that he reaches, because those people will go on to lead teams, divisions, organizations, communities, and they will make a difference. And so it starts with helping them think in a different way about what leadership is and what is our responsibility to the earth and our long-term choices.
You know, something you said earlier just keeps coming back to me. In Native American studies, we talk about 7 generations. So thriving, back to your point, is meeting quarterly numbers. If profit is the fuel that drives us forward, we need that, so I'm not saying we don't. And if I am leaving a legacy of a healthy organization and a healthy planet, and so often we think of us and profit as the money only, not the planetary impact we have that's now going to have to be cleaned up by tax dollars and super funds and other.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I had a journal article a couple years ago around deep time in leadership studies, and so kind of calling for an effort to help expose us all to integrate into leadership education and development, the ability to connect to, think in, and make decisions on longer timescales than we're accustomed to. I think that people can encounter that from any number of places. It can start in an organizational context. It can start at an individual level as we begin to see ourselves as part of histories and contexts and communities. And so there's a lot of different ways for people to connect with that idea, but I think it's one that we've neglected for too long.
You know, as I look at people being so distraught right now, if we step back and look at the trajectory of time, we're at a point, on many measures, we are as more successful than ever imagined by our forefathers.
Yes, and that doesn't eliminate the concerns that we have right now and the very real realities that some of us are living through. But I think it does provide a greater context for the work that we're engaged in.
So let's shift gears for 1 second, and then Kathy, we'll come back and do a closing comment. The ILA group that you co-host, just give us a minute on what is it for people who don't know anything about the International Leadership Association and that we even have groups. What does this group accomplish and why do they care?
So ILA has a number of kind of substructures to it that members can become participants in, and a number of us saw a need to have a group that would focus on leadership and sustainability a couple of years ago. So that was formally created in 2013. And because it's so young, we're really kind of still building out its identity and culture and community. To date, we know that there are over 600 ILA members who have, through their membership registration process, expressed explicit interest in this area, which is a really encouraging number. But Kathy and I have some plans about how to harness that interest and energy. We're going to be building out a larger, executive team to have more voices at the planning table, to enable more activities to be coming from this group. And one of our biggest areas is how we expand the ways in which we are interconnected to the other groups within ILA.
And I think associations, volunteer associations, have an immense power to transform the world. And sustainability, both the literature and the practice, one of the reasons why it keeps running under the radar is that there is no single leader that is the leader of the world on sustainability. But there are 3,000 or more of these kind of association groups that are influencing and are making change locally and regionally. And I think that really is the power of a movement. The way this has been structured is it's much more locally driven or contextually driven. And we're trying to build a stronger contextually driven focus within this professional association
That people
around
can then go
these
back to.
ideas, who will then go back and influence in their own sphere. And that we could create a space where they could feel supported, that we can share knowledge and insight and practice with each other, that makes our work even more effective in our context, where whatever that might be.
That's a brilliant note to wrap up on. Thank you so much. And for our listeners, I'm going to say the name of your books again, or will you?
Sure. So the book that I'm representing on behalf of many others is The Innovation in Environmental Leadership, Critical Perspectives.
And my book is called Leading from the Roots, Nature-Inspired Leadership Lessons for Today's World. And if people want to reach out to me, you can do it on my website, www.leadingfromtheroots.com.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom. And for our listeners, I really hope you heard something today, or a lot of things, that will help you update your thinking about leadership, and something that you may put in practice this week, next week, in the near future. So thank you for joining us, and we hope that you join us again next week.
This episode is brought to you by the Innovative Leadership Institute, working with companies that recognize the need to upskill their leaders and transform their organizations. What worked yesterday won't work today, and what works today won't work tomorrow. We help executive teams prepare for accelerated uncertainty by creating the foresight needed to stay competitive, elevating leaders to succeed, and transforming organizations to become future-ready. If you'd like to discuss how we can help prepare your organization for tomorrow, please visit innovativeleadership.com and click Contact Us.